Well, hello, and thank you to GrowSmart for having me, for all of you for attending today. I'm delighted to be speaking here because this summit is probing something that I'm extremely interested in, which is that essential relationship and tension between New England's civic traditions of local government and home rule, that system where every town, even if it only has a few hundred people, sees itself as a republic unto itself, and a frontier community of 10 sees itself and assumes itself to be such a republic in waiting, and the tensions that has with the clear efficiencies and advantages one would have via regionalization and centralization of some authorities. Now, as the proceedings continue, I expect that we'll all be delving into how to balance the strengths of each of these things and why we wish to do so, and some of the practical details of execution of such plans and the potential benefits. But before that, here at the outset, I wanted to offer an assessment of the legacy we've inherited, to describe why and when and how we here in New England and in Maine developed the structures we now have, and how they shaped who we are as communities, as a culture, as citizens. And therefore, I'm going to say a few words about, thereafter, I'm going to say a few words about a related and tangential set of developments, historical events that profoundly shaped Maine's character in ways distinct from our sibling states in New England, and because of the various strengths and pathologies that it imparted onto our culture and worldview, which are the backdrop to almost any economic venture or public policy discussion or intervention we contemplate, and revealingly, frequently fail to ever act upon in this state. Now, it's a thesis, if you will, about our state, my native state, as we contemplate and imagine a brave new post-coronavirus world. Now, this audience is by now no doubt familiar with the myriad problems of our traditions of home rule and municipal autonomy in a world where the individual's economic and social life takes place at a regional scale, and development decisions and infrastructure planning and technocratic solutions and markets require something approaching a county-scale strategy. We confront a balkanized landscape of often tiny jurisdictions jealously guarding their sovereignty, distrustful of their historic rivals in the town next door, and perhaps inefficient in the duplication of their administrative functions, institutions, and infrastructure that would be provided at the county level in many other parts of the country. Many of us live in one town, work in another, send some of our kids to a grade school in a third town, high school in a fourth, and do our major shopping in a fifth. We want community control, yet our formal definition of community remains rooted to 17th and 18th century spatial scales, when one could spend most of their lives within the bounds of a 6-mile square. The status quo, we've realized for some time, is holding us back. But often lost in the discussion about where we should be going are the strengths of this strong home rule system that has been bequeathed to us, the things we don't want to lose as we remake ourselves for the 21st century. Because this home rule system has roots going back to the very beginnings of the Yankee colonization experience and has profoundly shaped our regional culture in ways so fundamental and so taken for granted that we often fail to appreciate and recognize them. Now, the reason we have such a home rule system here, and to a lesser extent, the swaths of the country first colonized by New Englanders and their descendants in the late 17th to early 19th centuries, is because of the nature, goals, and worldview of the region's founding settlers. Now, those of you who have read American Nations knows that I argue that there was never one America, but several, that the rival colonial projects that took shape on the eastern and southwestern rims of what's now the United States, the Puritan colonies here in New England, the Dutch settled area around what's now New York City, the Scots-Irish-dominated backcountry, the neo-feudal manor-based aristocratic systems of the Chesapeake country, and so on, each had their own distinct ethnographic, religious, and cultural characteristics, were settled at different times and had conflicting ideas about what the good life entailed, about their own original intents, in other words, all the aspects of what anthropologists consider to be culture, that they were competitors and often even enemies during the colonial period, taking opposing stances in major conflicts like the English Civil War of the 1640s and the American Revolution, and that they settled mutually exclusive swaths and tiers of the country through the 1830s, imparting their institutions and cultural philosophies in ways that have endured and can be detected today in everything from dialect maps to election results to the effectiveness of the response to the ongoing pandemic. In most of these regions, central authorities gave land grants to a single person or corporate body, and dissemination of land and power followed downwards, top to bottom, usually resulting in powerful counties, weak to non-existent municipalities, and little control or public participation in politics. But by quirks of early 17th century history, this is not what happened here. The dominant colonizing force in our region wasn't a feudal lord or a chartered trading corporation. It was a group of people, stalwart Calvinists, who believed themselves to be like the Old Testament Hebrews in a covenanted relationship with God, that they had been tasked to come to the New World and to create a more perfect, in their minds, utopian society, a Zion, errand in the wilderness, to put a light on a hill, and that in this project that they had been tasked with by their Maker, they would be punished or rewarded collectively as to how they did. They saw a danger, being Calvinists and believing that humans are inherently depraved. You had to keep an eye on them, right? The danger was from within. An individual would rise up or betray the community and endanger it. And therefore, there was a great emphasis on protecting and building the community. What we would consider now building a free community, but for them trying to build their own utopian community. Everything was organized to prevent the outcome of the tyrannical individual rising up and lording over them and returning back to the situation they had fled from in the old world. Here, the towns came first, before any effective colony-scale government. The Pilgrims showed up here accidentally, remember, blown off their course from the Netherlands to New Netherland, and ended up as accidental squatters on the shores of Cape Cod, land claimed by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, the proprietor of Maine. In doing so, they ended up having to create their own improvised social contract, the Mayflower Compact, essentially an improvised town-scale republic, while they have waited getting retroactive permission to settle where they were located. The Puritans, coming with the Winthrop fleet in the 1630s, had many of these same characteristics. They founded Massachusetts Bay, and over the quarter century or so that followed, they annexed the old colony of the Pilgrims, they annexed Sir Ferdinando Gorges' struggling settlements here in Maine, they begat Connecticut, they sucked New Hampshire into their orbit, and created a sort of Yankee empire, spreading their New England way across the region. Now, they were not organized around an individual liberty or proprietary control, but on building this utopian society. So the institutions in the towns were all organized almost as little independent republics from the beginning, with a town common, a meeting house that acted as both church and town hall, taxpayer-financed public schools. The community would gather together to act as the legislature to administer this little tiny republic, initially adult males only, but they often met on a weekly basis. I mean, that was the level to which they were involved in the day-to-day affairs of figuring out what should go on, developing the community, laying out roads, divvying out land, catching the stray dogs and everything else. They elected officers to execute their plans, from selectmen to road builders to tax collectors. County governments were often an afterthought, coming quite a bit later, and usually confined to judicial functions. Today, counties have been abolished altogether in Connecticut and Rhode Island and most of Massachusetts, and of course have very limited roles here in Maine. Each of the towns sent their own representative from their town to the assembly. In other words, the towns were the republics operating under a collective body created later to deal with higher functions. Now, these evolved to cover all sorts of things that would be handled by cities most anywhere else in the country, or counties. The school system, libraries, building permits, planning, trash disposal, even in the early days, militias for defense. Philosophically, as the 18th century began, New England started embracing the fact that they had this legacy, realizing it was a vehicle for civic education and democratic engagement with fellow citizens, for therefore economic and social prosperity as they saw it. These town-scale institutions, especially town meeting, fostered political engagement, which created new political communities, which in turn trained citizens in the habits and skills of Republican self-government. Government was seen not as a distant and probably tyrannical power here, but as an extension of ourselves. These are our schools. This is our town library. These are our town policies. We know because we showed up and governed them. It's our schools and our school board. That's not the way the system worked in much of the rest of the country. Now, these factors were recognized all the way into the early Republic. John Adams, entertaining a visitor from Virginia in the 1780s, the visitor was concerned, he was one of the aides-de-camp to Lafayette, and then he had spent a lot of time walking. He would walk 50 or 60 miles a day to examine the countryside when he went back to France and was in the retinue of the King of France, and when he went to his home in Virginia, and when he visited New England, he was walking all over the countryside. And he came to Adams because he was so impressed and bowled over, in his view, of New England and how he felt it was superior in its civics and layout to his own home in Virginia. And he asked Adams, what would you do to make Virginia more like New England? Now, a lot of his counterparts would not have agreed with this, but this is what this particular visitor wanted to know. And Adams told him, if I were to write you a prescription for it, you'd create the meeting house, the schoolhouse, and the training field for the militia, that these are the causes of growth and defense of New England, that all the virtues and talents of the people are there formed, their temperance, patience, fortitude, prudence, and justice, as well as their sagacity, knowledge, judgment, taste, skill, ingenuity, dexterity, and industry, said Adams, the big proponent of New Englandness. Alexis de Tocqueville, coming a full 2 centuries after the Puritans had landed, was coming here. He was a French nobleman, and his task was to understand and take lessons back to France that could be used to hopefully foster a successful Republican democratic experiment there. Because France had had a revolution after ours, and it had, of course, failed, collapsed unto itself, led to the Napoleonic Empire and a terrible defeat and a highly centralized government. And he was coming here to try to learn lessons, and in the process, in writing his book, wrote what is, people always go back to as this sort of well of understanding our country through the eyes of a perceptive foreigner in 1831. And what his book said, in the end, most of all, the ultimate lesson was that the future success, the success to that point of the American democratic experiment, had to do with within ourselves, whether or not individuals could be Republican citizens, whether you could foster and perpetuate an environment, the social and community infrastructure, the legacy that would allow individuals to be prepared and want to and successfully engage in governing themselves. That was the entire trick to the experiment. And in his book, he, of course, idolized the New England town meeting as he encountered it. What he didn't fully appreciate, although he was being told by all of his sources in New England this, was that this, of course, form of government did not exist outside the greater New England space. And in fact, none of those lessons, which are brought forward in de Tocqueville's book, would apply in a good half of the country. And so his prescriptions were often missing many of the other regional cultures. But what he was being told, if you go back to his letters, from the people he spoke to, they were speaking very specifically of how New England functioned and how its strengths had drawn out of that experiment, had grown out of those habits of the heart that were created essentially by the local government traditions and the home rule system. His Jared Sparks, he was the editor of the North American Review, which is sort of like the Atlantic, all things considered, and PBS NewsHour all rolled together in that time period. He was sort of our country's first political scientist, and he basically told de Tocqueville, if you go back to his letters and stuff, he wrote, at de Tocqueville's request, an entire treatise on how town government had shaped New England that draws in and informed de Tocqueville's works, and essentially told him that the town meeting and its associated local government were the wellspring upon which New England functioned and which the whole democratic experiment rested on in this part of the world. And he was impressed by this because, imagine, compared to in France at the time, the things that he would see these tiny New England communities doing, road building, assessing taxes, running schools, were things that not only did towns in France not have the permission to do, only the authorities could execute those things. The central authorities operating out of Paris, the Interior Ministry, would have to be involved if you were to lay out a new road. And so that greatly impressed him as you look back. Emerson, in 1835, talked about this as well when he was celebrating the 2nd century of his hometown of Concord's birth, in an address where he talked about how that ownership, that sense that government is us, and that we participate in it actively, that we as individuals have been involved in it, that made people truly feel that they are lords of the soil. In every winding road, he said, in every stone fence, in the smokes of the poorhouse chimney, in the clock of the church, they read their own power and consider at leisure the wisdom and error of their judgments. That sense of government and tightness. And consider that, contrast it with the situation in, say, the Deep South and the Chesapeake country. In these areas, the model was a county courthouse, often located without a town around it, that protected in the original Tidewater, a English-style manorial estate. That was the model, right? In the Chesapeake country, they were coming there to reproduce the feudal system of the manorial countryside, to be sort of Lord Granthams, like a Downton Abbey of the time period, with indentured servants hopefully playing the role of the serfs. That didn't work, so it devolved into slavery. And in the Deep South, an entire slave system of major plantations was grafted directly from the West Indies by the early English Barbadian settlers into the low country of the South. But in both cases, the role of county government, of the county courthouse, in the absence of towns, was not to build community in that way, but to protect the rights and exclude others from one's property, family, or society at large. Counties were governed by justices of the peace, who were also the heads of the county courts. And these justices were not elected, they were picked by the governor or the legislature from slates of names submitted by the sitting justices themselves. The governors in many of these states were, of course, appointed by the legislators, not by the people, and to vote for a legislator, you had to meet strict property requirements and the like. Some were seen in this political tradition, this classical republican tradition, drawing on ancient Greece and Rome, to be fit to govern, and others to be governed, and that was the way society should be organized. This was realized even into Reconstruction, in that period when essentially the Yankee coalition had defeated and occupied the South and was trying to remake it in its image. That would be the cure to avoiding a future civil war, was to somehow occupy and remake the South as a Yankee place. And they saw the town government as the linchpin that came in and tried to actually organize New England-style town governments across many southern states. But these were violently resisted as being illegitimate because they were coming from a conquering power, and oppressive because of the power and politics and divisiveness of trying to undo the race-based slave and now caste systems in the South. And so it was thrown out in the 1870s, and the reaction in those regions of the country, something that persisted for nearly a century thereafter, was to make sure this never happened again by cutting and reducing the power, scope, and spending of the town and county governments even further, to neuter them so they could never again pose a threat to the proprietary interest. So that's changed in the South and the Tidewater, of course, but that's the legacy going back within living memory from which it's drawing to compare against the legacy of these strong home rule and town meeting government forms. So today, that's a lot of the reason why you see in New England at large the highest levels of civic engagement in the country, of voter participation, of communitarian resolve. Indeed, that's why it contributes a great deal to the fact that we have the lowest COVID-19 prevalence rates in the country, save for Vermont and trailing slightly behind New Hampshire. So these are things that we don't want to lose as we move forward and figure out how to do regionalization and operate at higher levels, that sense of ownership and resolve and civic engagement. Now, I also wanted to say a few things contextually about a related issue, and that affects a great deal about what happens in the state and our efforts to move forward, and sometimes there are things that hold us back. And that is that Maine did not start as part of this whole New England way and, Yankee ethos, right? Maine was founded by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, and it was supposed to follow essentially the same model as the Chesapeake country in Virginia, right? He was given control over, the entirety of all the land from, Virginia to Newfoundland in theory, and he was going to divide it out into, large, land settlements that would be given to dukes and called duchies, and they would divide them into counties for counts and baronies for barons and hundreds and farthings, and you'd have all the people working on the land and recreate that system, just as the Virginians wanted to do. And that probably would have led to very bad outcomes for Maine. But when the English Civil War came along in the 1640s, Sir Ferdinando's, understandably sided with the king and the Anglican established church and the powers and prerogative of royalty and the feudalism against the Parliament, who was standing for the other churches and for breaking down of these privileges. And Massachusetts Bay, of course, backed Parliament. And so in the aftermath of the English Civil War, when the king lost his head and Parliament was triumphant, suddenly Sir Ferdinando Gorges was without allies back at home. And Massachusetts, in the 1650s, moved creatively to annex in some cases with a force of arms and behind troops, the Maine settlements, which had been settled separately and had been independent. And the important part of this story for us thereafter is that from the 1650s through statehood, 200 years ago this year in 1820, Maine was something unusual in the North American experience. We were a colony of another colony. Not only that, an overseas colony, right? Massachusetts referred to us as the District of Maine because New Hampshire was in between. They didn't even border on us. And it ended up, well, all these things we just described, all of these advantages of the New England way and home rule and these things that are embedded in our culture and have given us these advantages I've described, and also some of the disadvantages, these things came from and after the Massachusetts takeover. But the colonial experience was, on balance, a very traumatic one in Maine despite this, because Massachusetts ruled Maine as a colony in the interests of the metropole of mainland Massachusetts, so to speak, not necessarily the settlers here. And there were very traumatic experiences because of the Puritans' worldview. It precipitated a century-long series of genocidal wars against the Native American inhabitants of New England. And during those wars, which lasted from King Philip's War in the 1670s all the way through what we call the French and Indian War in the 1760s, the brunt of the damage and trauma to the European side of the fights happened in Maine, because Maine was a frontier place where, despite the epidemics that had been introduced after contact within New England's indigenous communities, despite that, in the 1670s and 1710s and 1720s, Native Americans still outnumbered the English settlers here. And in Maine, unlike in Massachusetts, the settlements were following not the nucleated settlement, the patterns of little villages that the Puritans put together with their little republics unto themselves, but rather manorial estates, independent, self-sufficient farms set up and down creeks and rivers, just like in the English West Country, which were completely indefensible in time of war. So over and over again in these conflicts, one after another, a half dozen of them in this century-long period, most of Maine's settlements were wiped out. And the English settlers, escaped, to Damerscove and Monhegan, and then tried to get away to Boston, which was choked with refugees, and the tensions between the refugees from the Eastern Territories and from the metropole led to all kinds of problems, including the Salem witch trials, many of whose victims were in fact refugees from the Maine territories. But what ended up happening through the course of all of that is that Maine was stunted in its development, that it was not able at a time when the strategy was to move forward, right? Everyone was farming, and you had 7 kids. You couldn't all get a seventh of your farm because everyone would starve. So the strategy was they would then go out to the expanding frontier and settle new towns, and then the grandkids would be on the next set of frontiers. But during these Indian wars, essentially, it was impossible to extend into the frontiers because the frontier was dangerous, and therefore there was this enormous land hunger that had developed during this century. And that brought the second problem with the colonial period, the second traumatic experience, which was that the various proprietors and land interests in Massachusetts formed to try to capitalize on the likelihood that the wars would end and the property would become enormously valuable. And so they had on paper these huge land estates. The local settlers, though, who had been coming to these places without the permission of the landholders and settling the backcountry, often people of Scots-Irish descent with strong ideas about individual liberty and natural rights, fought back. And so as soon as the Indian Wars ended, Maine then experienced another nearly century of an armed insurrection in the backcountry between the squatters and earlier settlers and the ambitions of some of the great land proprietors like Henry Knox and the Bowdens and the Gardners and so on. I tell this story because that whole experience caused such animosity that it propelled Maine towards eventually passing a referendum on statehood, combined with Massachusetts' behavior in the War of 1812. That means that in many respects, from independence in 1820 and then the powerful pull that Massachusetts has continued to have on Maine's economy and society and development and demographics and everything else, that Maine has remained a post-colonial society in many respects in its outlook, right? Like other post-colonial societies, there's this sense of pride and defiance and oppositional stance and skepticism towards any ideas that come from the old empire, right? Massachusetts things are somewhat suspect in some way, in ways that are not constructive when it's our natural partner and we're part of the greater, sort of Boston MSA engine here. But that causes all of this friction and tension. But also a sense of, insecurity, self-doubt, risk aversion, right? That things won't pan out here somehow. That you can't think too big because all of it will come to naught. And that sense of not having the confidence to bet in ourselves. And that's something that I think has plagued our state and its sort of culture for a very long time. And when I speak to other people, it comes out in the business communities and others trying to do things and develop things, that sense of being unsure of those things. And it's unfortunate because Maine's no longer the economic backwater that it ended up being after the collapse of its traditional industries in the late 19th century. Our location now has enormous advantages. The internet and other technologies make it possible for us to play and realize our potential in many, many respects. And we draw on all these powerful strengths and traditions and resources, so we need to get over all of those things now. But recognizing that they're still with us has to be part of almost any conversation we have about our future. And with that, thank you very much. I'm going to stop. Thank you.